And we now transit to our next session, which is I've been really anticipating in this forum, because the person who is going to speak is, to be honest, my personal hero, David Sloan Wilson. David, many years ago, when I started to study evolutionary theory, of course, I was looking into various aspects of the theory and looking into the work of people such as Richard Dawkins, talking about selfish gene, didn't make much sense to me. And when I discovered your work around onto others and this work that highlights the multi-levels evolution, selection and evolution process, this made so much more sense. This really is what I think evolution is. It's happening on multiple levels at the same time. And we need, if we want to understand where humanity is going, we need to look at those high levels of collective evolution. And I'm especially thankful for you not to stay in this ivory tower of pure academic research, but really actively bring your approach into what we can call the conscious evolution of humanity through the change of culture. And this is what we are discussing today in this forum, how we can make that happen. And right now in this first panel, we spoke about conditions for creating a peaceful future and human security for all. How is that possible? That has to be a cultural change that starts from within. And your work in Prosocial is exactly about that. So I would like to bring it to you and to share about your work, your inspirations, and what we call narratives of conscious evolution. Please, David.
Well, thank you very much, Pavel. I feel I'm among kindred spirits here, very much in the avant-garde of this. So it's a real pleasure to be here. And let me. Oops, I need to. Could you enable screen sharing, please? There we go. Okay, well, so happy to be here and to have 30 minutes to say a lot. So here we go. Narratives of cultural evolution there's many of them, and they're very engaging and strong. It's quite motivating to think about consciously evolving our future. And so two well-known people are Teilhard de Chardin and Barbara Marx Hubbard, who have developed articulate narratives of conscious evolution. And I'd like to suggest that any narrative needs to be judged by three criteria. Number one, how psychologically motivating is it? How much does it get you out of bed in the morning? Does it energize you? Does it animate you? And this is sometimes called the vertical dimension. Number two, what does it cause people to do? Hopefully it causes them to do the right thing. So that's sometimes called the horizontal dimension. And number three, how well does it comport with current scientific knowledge? Now, this term vertical and horizontal dimension actually comes from the study of religions. And so the vertical, just to expand upon it a little bit, is the psychological dimension. It's the relationship between the person and the conception of the divine. And I think that's illustrated here on the top figure with a person actually having a relationship with Jesus. The horizontal dimension is the sociological dimension, the norms, rules, institutions that bind members of the faith to each other. And in some of my early work on this topic in my book, Darwin's Cathedral, I made a special study of Calvinism as it originated in Geneva in the 1500s, and the documents that Calvin wrote, his catechism, which articulated the nature of God and God's relationship with the person, and then the ecclesiastical ordinances, which set forth the norms, rules, and institutions for the city of Geneva. But all of this is needed by secular narratives, no less than religious narratives. And I think that counts especially on the vertical dimension, for the spiritual nature of environmental movements represented by Gaia. There's clearly a strong spiritual dimension to the people in this room. I'm certain of it. And so all narratives need both of these dimensions. And now a little more on the third criterion. Throughout history, how well a narrative comports with factual knowledge, you can say, has been the least important criteria. If a narrative is strongly motivated and gets you to do the right thing, then there's a sense in which who cares how well it comports with factual knowledge. And this is true not only for religions, but also for secular narratives. One of my favorite books on this topic is Above the Invention of Tradition. And what it shows is that how a culture imagines its past is at least as consequential as how it imagines its gods. And so nearly every culture invents traditions and then attributes much more antiquity to the traditions that it invents than actually exists, as any competent historian can show. And so this idea of adaptive fictions, stuff that we believe that's not out there, but helps us to navigate the world, survive and thrive in the world, exists for all world views. But today, in today's world, the need for narratives to be supported by the authority of science is stronger than ever. And the Dalai Lama, I think, represents a great case for this. He never loses an opportunity to say that there's 8 billion people in this world, and they will never belong to a single religion. Therefore, we need some way of communicating ethics for a whole world that does not rely on any particular religion. And so that third criterion, even though it has been expendable in the past, I think is now as strong as the other two criteria. So if I were to grade most narratives of conscious evolution on these criteria, I'd give them pretty high marks for the vertical dimension. They're inspirational. That's why we read them. Teilhard de Chardin is a personal favorite of mine. He just animates me with his language, and so high marks for the vertical dimension, but low marks for the horizontal dimension. To take Teilhard, for example, no congregations have formed around the writings of Teilhard de Chardin, and in so many cases, I belong to the evolutionary leaders, which is a group of well over 100 people who are crafting narratives of conscious evolutions. And I'd have to say in almost no cases does this result in groups of people that are actually bound together by norms, institutions, so on and so forth, unlike most organized religion. And then as to how well it comports with current scientific knowledge, again, believe it or not, quite low marks. The engagement with science is often quite superficial, and there's a reason for that, which I'm about to get to, or it's right here. It's not the fault of the storytellers. Until recently, there's been an almost total disconnect between narratives of conscious evolution and so-called hard evolutionary science. And so we can say that what became known as the modern synthesis, basically the way evolutionary biology developed in the 20th century, can also be called the Great Constriction, because it became confined almost entirely to the study of genetic evolution, as if the only way that offspring can resemble their parents is by sharing the same genes. And so the dogma that arose is that organisms vary at random. The immediate environment does the selection, no other purpose or direction to evolution whatsoever. And the study of human cultural evolution was relegated to other disciplines that developed in many different directions. And so proponents of conscious cultural evolution had basically very little from hard evolutionary biology to draw upon. That's represented by the image here, which has the famous quote by the geneticist Theodosis Dobzhansky, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. But what does it surround? The DNA helix, as if that's the only way that evolution takes place. And then we have this infinite quote by Richard Dawkins about the blind, pitiless indifference of the universe. Such infertile soil for a narrative of conscious evolution. So these narratives have to swim against the current, upstream, against the wind, from much of what's been known as hard evolutionary science. But that has changed, and so now we really do have, I would say, a whole new ballgame, a renaissance of thinking that is represented by these four key words: conscious, multi-level, cultural evolution. And I'm going to step through them in reverse order. So first, evolution has always had a broad sense of set of meanings. The word, of course, predates Darwin's use of it. But Darwinian evolution has a very specific definition as a process based on the three ingredients of variation, selection, and replication. Organisms vary in just about everything that could be measured. These differences make a difference in terms of survival and reproduction, and the traits of organisms tend to be inherited by their offspring. That's Darwinian evolution, and it's very specific. And then generalized Darwin, what's new and what's only taken place during the last few decades, is to include any process combining these ingredients, including but not restricted to genetic evolution. And so cultural, what this means is that generalized Darwinism includes cultural evolution in addition to genetic evolution. Many species have cultural traditions, including so-called lower animals, such as insects, in addition to so-called higher animals, such as primates and birds. But in our species, we're kind of in a class by ourselves, and that is because our capacity for symbolic thought, which is distinctively, maybe even uniquely human. And it's symbolic thought that enables humans to pass information, basically, culturally, down the generations more than any other species. And that's represented by this diagram here. So let me just step through it very quickly. So every one of you has a collection of genes. We call that your genotype. Those genes influence just about everything that could be measured in you. We call that your phenotype. But because you're human, every one of you has a collection of symbols, a symbolic system inside your head. Let's call it your symbotype to stress the comparison with a genotype. And your symbotype also influences just about everything that could be measured in you, your very same phenotype. And so your genotype and your symbotype interact with each other during your lifetime with mechanisms such as epigenetics, and have also been co-evolving with each other ever since our origin as a species. And so what makes us so very special as a species is very largely our capacity for symbolic thought and our high degree of cooperation, which makes symbolic thought as a form of cooperation possible. And so so all forms of evolution are multi-level. And so here's a meme that I coined with the other Wilson, Edward O. Wilson: selfishness beats altruism within groups, altruistic groups beat selfish groups, everything else is commentary. So let me unpack that. First of all, what we can say, this is a fundamental problem of social life, is that everything we call prosocial, everything that we extend that involves extending ourselves towards the welfare of others or our group as a whole, has an inherent disadvantage compared to more self-oriented behaviors within the same groups. That's the selfishness beats altruism within groups part. In addition, these prosocial behaviors have an inherent advantage at the between group level, namely, groups of individuals who behave prosocially towards each other will robustly outcompete groups of individuals who cannot cohere. And so what we have in evolution are opposing forces that weigh in the direction of selfishness or altruism and all forms of prosociality. And which one wins the Darwinian contest depends on the balance between levels of selection. Is the selection within groups stronger or between groups stronger? And an example that I've used for many decades to illustrate this is a real experiment. It was done on hens. The goal was to breed a more productive strain of egg-laying hens. And in both cases, the hens were housed in cages, I'm sorry to say. And in the first experiment, the most productive hen within each cage was chosen to breed the next generation of hens. And in the second experiment, the most productive cages were chosen, and all of the hens within those cages were used to breed the next generation of hens. And what happened in the first experiment was that basically what was being selected was the biggest bully in each group, who was achieving her productivity by suppressing the productivity of other hens. It turns out that egg laying is not just an individual trait, it's a social trait. And so this is the selfishness beats altruism within groups part. It's a highly heritable trait. And so in 5 generations, we had bred a strain of hyper-aggressive hen who murdered each other and plucked each other's feathers in their incessant attacks. Then the second experiment, that was between group selection. Then we were basically selecting the hens that got along with each other. And after 5 generations, you'd bred a hyper-cooperative or at least a hyper-tolerant hen, and egg productivity arose 160%. So there is multi-level selection in a nutshell. And there's a wonderful podcast that's been produced by National Geographic. I strongly encourage you to Google the problem with super chickens, National Geographic, and there's a very entertaining podcast that gives human examples of this in addition to the hens. So this logic can be extended to multiple levels, and what we can say is that multi-level selection is like a perverse alchemist who turns gold into lead. So self-preservation, a good thing, permutes into self-dealing. Helping family and friends, a good thing, becomes nepotism and cronyism. Maximizing shareholder profits, a good thing, becomes extreme inequality. Growing the economy, a good thing, becomes overheating the earth. Isn't it amazing that nearly everything that we regard as corrupt at a larger scale is actually a form of virtue at a smaller scale? So what we can see from multi-level selection is that prosociality is both the problem and the solution. Evolution does not make everything nice. And so that brings us to conscious. So evolution does not make everything nice. And so what we can say, the good news is that worldwide cooperation can evolve. We can show this, but only when special conditions are met. And if these special conditions are not met, we will experience the evil alchemist, perverse alchemist problem. And so it's up to us to provide the special conditions using the best of our scientific knowledge. And so that's what I've been doing. Thanks to Pavel for noting that this is something that very much has to take place outside the ivory tower. This is by no means an academic exercise. And since my time with you is so short, then I'm just going to give you a brief taste on what it means to provide the special conditions for prosociality to evolve. It's based on Eleanor Ostrom, a person that I'm betting some, but not all of you know, because that's true for every audience that I address. She was a political scientist who won the Nobel Prize in economics in 2009. And she studied the famous tragedy of the commons, groups that manage common pool resources, such as forests, fields, fisheries, and irrigation systems. And conventional wisdom was selfishness in this context, of course, involves taking more of the resource than your share, and that is sustainable. And the conventional wisdom was that the tragedy would always occur unless the resource can be privatized or regulation is imposed top down. And what Eleanor showed was, by actually studying common pool resource groups around the world, is that some, not all, but some, were capable of self-managing their resources if they possess certain core design principles. And I worked with Eleanor for the last 3 years before her death to generalize these principles from an evolutionary perspective. So I'm about to show you these principles, and but before I do, I want you to bring a group to mind, some group that you know well, and then see if your group implements these core design principles, and then if that might have something to do with how well your group performs in its as a cooperative unit. And so the groups that are capable of managing their own affairs have a clear sense of identity and purpose. They know they're a group. They know that their group is important. They know who's a member, so on and so forth. There's an equitable distribution of benefits and resources, not sustainable for some members of the group to get the benefits and others to do most of the work. Decision-making needs to be inclusive, not sustainable for some members to call the shots and other members to be cut out of the decision-making process. Transparency of behaviors. We need to know whether or not we are doing the things that we are supposed to be doing. Graduated responding to unhelpful and helpful behavior. If we're not doing what we should, then that needs to be corrected, but it doesn't have to start out harsh or mean. A friendly correction is often sufficient, yet it must be possible to escalate in those cases where it is necessary. And in addition, we need to respond to helpful behavior and shower it with praise and a good reputation and all the benefits that come with it. Fast and fair conflict resolution. Conflicts will occur and they need to be managed, resolved in a way that's regarded as fair by all parties. Autonomy and authority to self-govern, basically, because without being able to have the elbow room to manage your own affairs, then you can't work on the first 6 core design principles. And finally, appropriate relations with other groups, which basically implement the same core design principle. So this is crucial, that these core design principles are scale independent. They're needed for relations among groups in addition to relations within groups. And so think about how well your group did. And I think what you'll probably see, because it's pretty obvious, is that these core design principles make perfect sense from a multi-level evolutionary perspective. In a group that implements these core design principles, it's just very hard to play the first chicken experiment. It's very hard to be disruptively self-serving thanks to these core design principles. So what they have done is they suppressed the potential for disruptive competition within groups so that the group becomes the primary unit of selection and cultural evolution. So we could call this a miniature major evolutionary transition for the group. And so, but this, of course, we have to go beyond single groups and apply this to multi-contexts and multi-groups. This again is part of Elinor Ostrom's legacy called polycentric governance. And so what we need to work towards, if we're really going to succeed, is to create frameworks in which individuals, that's level 1, are members of small teams, level 2, representing organizations, level 3, that expect to work with each other, level 4. And that this framework is in perpetuity, so that there's continuous interactions is needed for continuous evolution. And so Prosocial World is developing a framework for this team of teams frameworks, and I bet some of you are too. In fact, I'll bet some of you are doing it so well that you're doing it better than we are. So it's very important to get together and compare notes. There's a sense in which this is not new, and in fact, it's been arrived at again and again and again. That's called convergent cultural evolution, but there's a huge added value for seeing it for the generality that it is, as opposed to arising in certain contexts and then having difficulty expanding beyond its culturally defined borders. And so in closing, I think that it is realistic in the near future to pull straight A's on all three of these criteria. And so I'm just going to end here. I'm going to leave this up for a couple of minutes so that you can scan that QR code if you like for more. We have a recent article in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that goes through this in more detail. I have a short essay on the beauty and necessity of structure. Just Google that with my name, and I think you'll get there, which really stresses the need for this horizontal dimension, because it's my experience in movements such as this, because they are strong on the first criterion, but there's an implicit assumption that after you motivate someone to be compassionately minded, that they'll simply go forth and act in a compassionate fashion, and very little guidance. Pavel, I'm glad to see you nodding your nodding your head, is given for what we do in the world, the outer, in addition to the inner. And so that little essay makes that point. And so I end with the final passage of this PNAS article. Once this is comprehended in all its generality, we can look forward to a surge of effective policies that consciously evolve a world that works for all. So with that, I thank you very much. And we have 1 minute for questions, unless you want to extend the Q&A a few minutes.
Thank you, David. Very, very inspirational, and gives us hope. This possible future AAA ranked approach. Well, my nodding of head was coming from a lot of pain of experience of actually moving from this vertical to horizontal dimension in the past, and exactly recognize that this is the failure, the lack of structure. Once the movement go beyond, like, let's say, very small groups into larger world, that's exactly what is happening. So let's say we have a room for one question, and whoever is brave to ask that question, please raise your hand. It's quite a big room of more than 50 people, but I'm sure someone will step up.
I think I seem to have intimidated everyone.
All right. You know, David, one of the ways to handle is, I'm sure there will be lots of questions, but I'm sure these questions we need to also ask from the practical lens. As we ourselves see this gathering as a gathering, what I call, of tribes, of movements, or communities of change makers. And there are many who will have a lot of practical questions. And our objective is actually to begin some kind of platform, which we call University for the Planet. It's not really a university, but more like a learning community or a learning ecosystem of a kind. And we want to build it up on certain principles that are also scientifically corroborated. So your work, to me, is one of the foundations that we definitely need to use in bringing this work forward. So maybe the invitation would be to let's explore this together, and not just one-off meeting, but more like a continued ways of engaging with each other. And thank you for doing your work in the world.
Yeah, so before signing off, I think that's exactly right. And what I find is that this body of information is so new that people who are brilliant in every other aspect and well-read in every other respect simply have not encountered it yet. It's an encounter rate problem. And so the more that we can just spread the ideas, and there's many ways to do that. There's lots of resources that are out there, and anything that resembles a university, of course, is what that's all about, then is going to be enormously helpful all by itself, because the worldview is not at all difficult to understand. And once you do so, it provides you with a new common sense. Just basically, other things make sense. And then there is, once again, the need for to transition from individuals to groups. So that's a major transition. Am I in an event such as this? Am I talking to an individual or am I talking to a group? That's very important. And let's do what we can to be talking to groups. There is so much more power in working, and not just a group, but in appropriately structured groups. Groups are not good by themselves, and they're not effective by themselves. Even small groups are not effective by themselves. They must have appropriate structure, and that's not difficult either. None of this is difficult. And then, of course, there must be means to communicate with other groups. Lev, I think that in the comment that you made just shortly before my talk, I think that you were actually talking about a structure of many groups and interacting among groups that is probably, I hope, representing this. And in a case like that, of course, we simply want to, we surely want to learn from your experience and to share our experience with you. So there's a level of cooperation among consortiums. You know, sometimes we build up to the consortium level, but then there's a whole galaxy of consortia that are not interacting with each other, that are occupying separate universes. And so we must work on a level of coordination at that level. So all of this is doable, especially in the internet age, with meetings such as this. And then, and of course, you know that my organization, Prosocial World, is hopeful to be an agent in this this vast operation. So thank you very much. And yeah, this should not be a one-off. And Pavel, I know that you and I are going to be engaged. And hello to some people that are from the past, including Hasina. Hey, Hasina, how are you? So we'll I'll check out now, and thank you once again for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you, David. It was a privilege to be with you today, and a lot of inspiration for, I guess, all of us, and a message of hope. That is what I sense.
Oh yeah, a lot of hope.
Hold on. Thank you.